The wind howled like a banshee across the desolate range, a blizzard whipping snow into a blinding fury. It clawed at the rough-hewn walls of the cabin, a relentless assault against the fragile warmth within. Elias Thorne stoked the fire, the familiar scent of burning pine a meager comfort against the vast, indifferent white outside. Years he had lived here, alone save for the grudging company of his horses and the stubborn cattle, a man carved from the same hardscrabble landscape that surrounded him. His solitude was a chosen cloak, thick and impenetrable. Until the knock. It wasn't a tentative rap, but a frantic pounding, swallowed by the storm's roar then repeated, desperate. Elias frowned, gun already in hand as he approached the door, the heavy bar scraping back. He cracked it open, cold air and snow blasting inward. Silhouetted against the churning white stood figures, huddled together, indistinct shapes in the maelstrom. He saw a flash of impractical fabric, heard a woman's cry swallowed by the wind. 12 of them, the frantic voice gasped, seeking shelter, running from. It didn't matter what they ran from, not in this. He stood there for a long moment, the blast of Arctic air raising gooseflesh despite the fire at his back. 12 women. Here. Now. The sheer absurdity of it warred with the stark reality of their peril. No one could survive long out there. Reluctantly, he pulled the door wider, stepping back. "Get in," he rasped, his voice rusty from disuse. They tumbled inside, a chaotic heap of silk, lace, and terror, shivering uncontrollably. The door slammed shut, barring out the storm but not the silence that fell heavy and thick in its wake. 12 pairs of eyes, wide and fearful, stared at him from faces pale with cold and exhaustion, smudged with dirt and desperation. Saloon girls. It was written in their painted faces, the gaudy remnants of their costumes, the way they clung to each other as if for life. Alara, near the front, met his gaze. Hers held fear, yes, but also a spark of something else, something that looked suspiciously like defiance beneath the vulnerability. Her dress, a scandalous shade of crimson, was torn at the hem, plastered to her legs with melting snow. Elias didn't speak. He moved past them, back to the fire, adding another log. The air in the small cabin grew heavy with unspoken questions, with the scent of wet wool and cheap perfume, a stark contrast to the usual smells of wood smoke, leather, and horse. He wasn't a man for questions, not for pleasantries. He simply existed, and now apparently they did too in his space. He gestured towards the floor near the hearth with the poker. "You can stay there for now. Keep the fire going." It wasn't an invitation, merely a statement of necessary fact. The storm wouldn't break for days. He had food, meager but enough for one. 12. It would be stretched thin. He didn't like it. He didn't like any of it. But the mountain had forced his hand. Survival was a cold, hard arithmetic. The women huddled together, a collective sigh of relief whispering through the room as they absorbed the warmth. Some wept silently. Others simply stared into the flames, their eyes vacant with shock. Alara watched him, her gaze steady. He felt it, a prickle on his skin. He was used to being invisible. This woman saw him, not as a savior or a threat, but simply as the man in front of her. It was unsettling. The night stretched before them, long and uncertain, filled with the sound of the storm and the quiet presence of strangers bound together by the cruel caprice of the weather and whatever darkness they had outrun. His solitary world had just shattered into a dozen pieces, and he had no idea how to put it back together. The first days were a study in stark contrasts. The small cabin, adequate for one man's Spartan existence, was impossibly crowded with 12 women. Their former lives had not prepared them for this. They shivered in their thin clothing, their elaborate hairstyles quickly collapsing into tangled messes. The scent of perfume faded, replaced by the simple smell of wood smoke and damp wool. Elias set them tasks, not out of kindness, but necessity. Water had to be fetched from the frozen creek, wood chopped, the fire fed constantly. Tasks that required strength and endurance they lacked. Their initial attempts were clumsy, often failing. He watched from the corner of his eye as they struggled with axes too heavy, buckets too cold to carry. Complaints, hushed and fearful, rippled through the group. They were helpless, adrift without the familiar structure of the saloon, the predictable demands of their patrons. They looked at him with a mixture of fear and resentment, expecting commands, perhaps even cruelty. But Elias gave little beyond silent demonstration. He would chop wood for a time, his movements economical and strong, then simply stop, leaving the axe for them. He showed them the creek, the weakest spot in the ice, then left them to it. Survival was a lesson learned by doing or not learned at all. Alara was different. While the others faltered, wept, or complained, she watched him, observed. She saw the rhythm of his work, the angle of the axe head, the way he handled the frozen wood. On the second day, while the others huddled by the fire, she picked up the axe. Her first swing was awkward, barely nicking the log. Her hands, soft from years of card dealing and pouring drinks, blistered quickly. She winced, but she didn't stop. She adjusted her stance, mimicking his posture from memory. Her movements were slow, inefficient, but persistent. Elias saw it. He didn't comment. Later that day, he found a pair of worn leather gloves and dropped them by the woodpile without a word. Alara looked at him, her eyes conveying a silent question, a tentative gratitude. He simply turned back to mending a saddle strap. It was the beginning of an unspoken understanding. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was asking how to survive. And he, in his own gruff way, was showing her. The others began to follow her lead, hesitantly at first. One woman, Martha, discovered a knack for mending clothes, using threadbare scraps Elias provided. Another, a quiet girl named Bess, seemed to understand his horses, speaking softly to them in the small corral when the blizzard finally eased enough to check on them. They weren't saloon girls anymore. They were simply women trying not to die, finding unexpected reserves of strength in a world that demanded it. The cabin became less a place of terrified refuge and more a place of grim work. The tension was still present, a thin wire stretched taut, but beneath it, something else was beginning to form, a fragile sense of purpose, born from shared hardship. Elias remained a distant figure, a force of nature as stoic and unpredictable as the landscape outside, but he was their anchor in this bewildering reality. Weeks bled into months. The blizzard broke, replaced by the brutal cold of deep winter. The women, clad now in layers of borrowed or remade clothing, had settled into a demanding routine. Alara, her hands calloused and strong, worked tirelessly alongside Elias, chopping wood, hauling water, learning to prepare the simple, repetitive meals. She didn't speak much, and neither did he. Their communication became a language of shared glances, small gestures, movements in concert. He would point to a task. She would begin it. She learned the rhythm of his day, anticipating needs. He, in turn, seemed to soften almost imperceptibly, ensuring there was enough food, repairing leaky spots in the roof she pointed out. The cabin, once alien, began to feel less so. The women, stripped of their former identities, forged new ones. Martha became the group's quiet, maternal center, keeping spirits from completely breaking. Bess continued her silent communion with the horses. Others found ways to contribute, cleaning, organizing, tending a small patch of ground near the cabin where Elias allowed them to try planting hardy root vegetables as spring approached. They weren't skilled ranchers, but they were resilient, resourceful, and they had learned to rely on each other in ways their previous lives had never required. But the shadow of what they had fled remained. Whispers traveled even across the vast emptiness of the range. Elias, on his infrequent trips to the distant general store, heard rumors of men searching, asking questions about missing women. He never shared the details, but his silence grew heavier, his gaze more watchful towards the horizon. The women felt it too, a tightening knot of fear. They knew the saloon owner, Silas, was not a man who let perceived slights go unpunished, nor valuable property disappear without consequence. Their time of precarious safety was limited. One evening, as the sun dipped below the snow-capped peaks, casting long blue shadows, Alara found Elias by the corral, watching the western trail. He didn't acknowledge her presence immediately. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Finally he spoke, his voice low and rough. "They're getting closer." It wasn't a warning, just a statement of fact, devoid of emotion. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She looked at the desolate landscape, then back at the cabin where the lamplight cast a warm, inviting glow. This small, hard-won haven. "We can't go back," she said, her voice firm. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes, the color of faded denim, meeting hers. He saw not the painted girl who had stumbled out of the storm, but a woman tempered by hardship, standing tall against the gathering twilight. He nodded slowly. The decision was made. Whatever came, they would face it here, together. The fragile peace they had built was about to be tested by the violence they had tried so desperately to leave behind. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon like a smudge on the clear morning sky. Silas and his men. There were 4 of them, riding hard. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fragile calm the women had built. They gathered outside the cabin, eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Alara stood beside Elias, her heart pounding, but her gaze steady. They had no weapons to speak of, save for Elias's rifle and the axes they now knew how to wield. Their strength lay not in arms, but in their numbers and their shared determination not to return to a life of degradation and fear. Elias moved with quiet purpose. He positioned the women, giving them simple, critical instructions. Martha was to keep the fire roaring. They would need boiling water. Bess was with the horses, ready to spook them if necessary. Others were shown where to scatter rocks, where to hide if things went badly. There was no panic, only a grim resolve forged over months of hardship. These weren't the terrified women who had arrived in the blizzard. They were different now. Silas rode up first, stopping a short distance from the cabin. He was a thick man, his face florid, his eyes hard and cruel. His men fanned out slightly behind him. He grinned, a wolf showing its teeth. "Well now, look what we have here," he sneered, his gaze raking over the women, who stood silent and defiant behind Elias. "Seems my property decided to take a little vacation." Elias stepped forward, his presence a wall of quiet strength. He didn't raise his voice. "They ain't your property, Silas. Not out here." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Everything's property, Thorn, one way or another. And these girls owe me a lot. Now step aside." "They stay," Elias stated flatly, raising his rifle. The standoff hung heavy in the air. 4 armed men against 1 rancher and a dozen women. The odds were clear, but Silas hesitated. There was something in Elias's eyes, a quiet certainty that gave him pause. And the women, they weren't cowering. They stood their ground, their faces set. Silas barked an order to his men. They dismounted, starting to advance. Elias fired a single shot, not at a man but into the ground before them. It was a warning, clear and final. As the men faltered, Alara acted. She had taken up an axe, holding it steady. At a silent signal from Elias, she moved, not towards the men, but towards their horses, followed by several other women wielding rocks and tools. They didn't need to fight the men, only deny them their escape. Chaos erupted. As Elias exchanged fire with Silas's men, keeping them pinned, the women unleashed a furious, coordinated assault on the horses. Yelling, waving arms, throwing stones, they spooked the animals, sending them scattering across the range. The men were left on foot, exposed. The fight was short and brutal. Elias, moving with surprising speed and skill, engaged the dismounted men. Alara and the women retreated to the cabin, barring the door, ready with boiling water if anyone breached it. The sounds of struggle, shouts, and gunshots echoed, then silence. Slowly, tentatively, the women emerged. Elias stood, wounded but upright, 2 of Silas's men on the ground, incapacitated. Silas and the 4th had vanished, retreating on foot towards the distant horizon. A long, impossible walk back. They wouldn't be returning. The aftermath was quiet, marked by tending wounds and burying the dead. Not all of the women remained after the confrontation. Some, witnessing the violence, chose to move on, seeking a different kind of anonymity. But 8 stayed. They had faced death together, fought for their freedom, and in doing so had claimed this desolate ranch as their own, not by right, but by sweat and courage. Elara stood on the porch as the sun warmed her face, the wind still present, but no longer hostile. Her life was unrecognizable. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it was overlaid with a resilience she had never known she possessed. She looked at Elias, sitting on the steps, watching the range with his usual quiet intensity. The ranch was harsh, demanding, but it was real. And so were the bonds forged here, stronger than any silk or lace, any painted smile or whispered promise. They had come seeking shelter from a storm, fleeing a life of pretense. They had found not just refuge, but a chance to build something true, piece by painful piece, in the heart of the wilderness. They were no longer 12 saloon girls. They were simply women, survivors, standing on their own ground, ready to face whatever the horizon held. The future was uncertain, etched against the vast, indifferent sky, but for the first time in a long time, it was theirs to shape.